Welcome to University of Phoenix's Information Systems Security, CMGT431. I'm Tom Olzak, and I will be the instructor for this class. The content for this lecture is taken primarily from Stephen Hernandez's Guide to the CISSP CBK, or Common Body of Knowledge. This is the ISC Squared's official guide, and we will be using it throughout the class for all the lectures. So if there's any deviation from any of the material that is provided in the classroom, if it differs from the guide at all, the guide wins. So in this lecture, we're going to look at the security triad, the 10 CISSP domains, the various categories of controls. We're going to look at identification and authentication, what they are, how they differ, and how they support each other. We're going to look at major security risks, governance, and we're going to walk through a risk assessment and look at formulaic models for managing risk. The security triad consists of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is protecting information from anyone who isn't authorized to see it. In other words, it enforces need to know. Integrity enforces the accuracy or deals with the accuracy of information. We do this by only allowing people who are authorized to do so to modify information. And availability is about keeping business systems and data available so that critical business processes can continue to operate. So these are the 10 CISSP domains. Domain 1, access control, telecommunications is number 2. I'm not going to read these to you. You can read them off the slide yourself. We're going to go into more detail on these in subsequent slides. So domain 1, access control. So most of what we do in security from a day-to-day basis is controlling access to information. We determine what people, processes, or devices, known as the subjects, can access, and those resources they can access are known as the objects. So subjects, access, objects. And again, we're not just controlling what people can access an object. We're controlling also what processes or devices can access an object. Examples of access controls can, include file permissions, program permissions, and data rights. To enforce access control, we use the AAA, or the 3 A's: authentication, authorization, and accountability. Authentication identifies someone as being who a person or process or device as actually being who or it claims to be. This is usually done with user IDs and passwords, but can also be done with other things like tokens, biometrics, and certificates. Authorization takes place after authentication and specifies what the verified identity or the verified subject is allowed to access and what they can do with the object once they access it. And accountability tracks both authorized and unauthorized access to objects. All 3 of these together comprise access control. Domain 2 is telecommunications and network security. It deals with all the controls from devices down to how those devices talk to each other, its processes for implementing new systems. It is the security processes that are followed every day or during the software development or system development life cycles. Protect data at rest and while in motion. Domain 3 is information security, governance, and risk management. We're going to spend a lot of time on this in this lecture, but Risk management and security governance deal with reducing risk and monitoring to ensure that risk is at levels expected by management. It includes development of policy, standards and baselines, guidelines, procedures, data classifications, performing risk assessments, and the top bullet, identification of assets, is also known as inventory control. If you look under the recommended material for this class, you'll see that I've included a short article on the missing inventory controls or inventories. If you don't know what you have, you cannot assess the risk presented by those devices or the risk to those devices and how that might impact critical business processes. This takes a little closer look at policy, standards, and guidelines and procedures and how they relate. Management develops policy. The policies state management's expected outcomes for different things. And policies usually are applied at enterprise level, which covers everything in the enterprise, at system level, which covers a specific system, and at issue level, which covers certain behaviors of the of employees, of business partners, etc. So from policy, we derive standards and guidelines. Standards are required actions that must be taken under certain conditions. Guidelines are recommended actions that are to be taken. So, for example, a policy might state that the organization must assign strong authentication to all users accessing highly sensitive data. The standard for that policy might be that all users that access highly sensitive information must use passwords that meet certain criteria. That might state that they must use a token or biometrics, etc. But it would specify what steps need to be taken to reach the outcomes. Now, this is not to be confused procedure. Standards are, it's the bar that must be reached when implementing controls or implementing business processes. And guidelines are simply recommendations. In many cases, it's not appropriate to set a standard when some flexibility is needed by management down in the trenches when they're putting their procedures together. And that brings us to procedures where managers can build procedures, step-by-step processes that employees follow to consistently comply with standards and guidelines, which also then means they're complying with policy. So if an employee is trained in business processes and standards and guidelines are integrated for security are integrated into those procedures, then the employees will consistently comply with company policy. So that's how these three things are related. Policy drives standards and guidelines, which then enable management to put together security-enabled procedures. Domain 4, security development, software development security. So software is defined as operating systems, applications, and applications are anything, any kind of software that runs on a device. Agents, applets, databases, data warehouses. It also deals with integrating security into the software or system development life cycles. For example, in the initiation phase of the SDLC, you should do a preliminary risk assessment to help define security requirements for the proposed solution that the team is working on. A risk assessment should be done during the design and implementation phase to make sure that all requirements are addressed and that no unknown risks during the initiation phase have arisen due to design changes or to functional requirement changes. Integrating security with SDLC is absolutely necessary if we want to produce solutions for the business that are secure from the time they're implemented, that are easy to manage access controls and availability, because we built it in, because it isn't something that we try to throw at it later. It's actually built into the solution. Domain 5 is cryptography. Cryptography is the science of taking plain text and making it totally unreadable unless you have the key. This is used for non-repudiation. In other words, you can use it to have people sign a document, which is normally used with a hash, so that they can't say later that they didn't send something or do something because it's signed with their electronic signature. Authentication and access control are closely related. In many cases, we use cryptography or encryption to prevent unauthorized individuals from accessing data. As we're going to talk about a little later when we get to physical security, one of the biggest problems with securing laptops and other mobile devices is that once an attacker has physical access to a device, if the data is not encrypted, pretty much game over. So encryption is a very strong access control. It also is a good way to prevent anyone who accesses your network from the outside from getting to data without going through approved interfaces. Now, that doesn't mean they can't do it. That doesn't mean that you may not have weaknesses in those interfaces that allow them to access it. But they won't be able to just drop onto a database server and start copying off information because it'll be meaningless. Domain 6, security architecture and design. Security architecture is something that you put into place so that when you build controls, you build them so that they integrate with what you already have. They meet or they comply with your security strategies. And security architecture and design includes security processes, information security systems, your security teams, and anything that in your organizational subunits that deals with maintaining the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your systems. It answers the what, the why, and the how. Now, what it doesn't answer, security architecture does not answer specifically what controls you will put in. What it does answer is what types of controls are necessary, how you're layering your controllers, how you build security zones on your networks, whether or not you're going to segment your networks, those types of things. So you can get more detail on that with your actual control designs. So this is a graphic from one of my books that shows how the different architectures are related to the security architecture. The information architecture is based on the business strategy and relevant regulations. The information architecture is supported by the network, systems, and software architectures, and these are all the foundation of all these, the thing that enables the organization to build these other architectures and provide a safe operating environment is a security architecture. And the security architecture is composed of policies, tools, standards and guidelines, controls, and processes. In other words, it drives those things. So this, from the security architecture, we derive policy, we derive tools, we derive standards and guidelines, controls, and processes, and then we measure the effectiveness of what we're doing. And this is a cyclical operation. Security is not something we throw in place and then, and even the security architecture, it's not something we throw in place and then forget about it. It's something we're always evaluating, something that we're adjusting as we do root cause analyses after incidents, or when a new threat comes out and we do a risk assessment and we determine that maybe our controls are not effective enough against the vectors, the attack vectors that particular threat might use. Domain 7 is security operations. This is the day-to-day activities of the security team, monitoring, auditing, and the maintenance. It is the domain that deals with the continued operation of the business. Keeps the systems up and running. It makes sure that that all the controls are operating properly so that we can protect our assets. It is about configuring accounts correctly and making sure that we get rid of accounts when people leave the organization, that we properly onboard employees when they come into the organization, that we correctly adjust permissions when someone changes jobs. And then there's security services management, like things like log management and security information and event management. Domain 8, business continuity and disaster recovery planning. The umbrella for this is business continuity planning. Disaster recovery planning falls under business continuity planning. Business continuity planning is the identification of critical business processes and the technology that supports them, and understanding what the business impact would be if one of those systems failed, or any component of the technology that supports the business process fails. It is understanding the maximum tolerable period of downtime that a process can be down before irreparable damage happens to the business. And business continuity planning doesn't just deal with catastrophic events. It deals with a server going down. What do you do? What plans do you have in place if a server goes down that supports a critical business process? How long can you be without that server? These are questions that need to be answered. And the disaster recovery planning deals with more with catastrophic events. What happens if you lose your data center? What happens if you have no access to your data center because of a blizzard, because of some other event? Could be geopolitical, could be natural, anything that keeps you from operating your data center, operating your business. Business impact analysis is a component that is not only used for business continuity and disaster recovery planning, but it's also part of risk assessments. What is the business impact? What losses will the business incur because a server goes down, or because the data center is not available? The business impact analysis helps to determine how much you're going to pay, or how much money you will spend to ensure that you can recover within a maximum period of tolerable downtime. And one thing that's very important to take away is that human safety is the highest priority. Regardless of the business critical processes and the technology involved, safeguarding our employees, our customers, and anyone else that might be on the premises is our number one concern when planning for business continuity events. Domain 9, legal regulations, investigations and compliance. This deals with ethical and legal behavior. Legal behavior is something that is required by law. Ethical behavior is something that is driven by the the moral environment in which the business operates, and that can change from culture to culture, from country to country. It's important to understand that forensics are the activities surrounding identifying what causes a security incident, who was involved, trying to identify the perpetrator. It's part of incident response. Forensics and incident response are closely related. We're going to see later in the lecture that part of risk is business impact. And incident response, the faster we can respond to an incident, contain it, and recover from it, the less business impact there is. And so incident response is a critical component of any security program. And forensics is part of the program, the incident response process, that allows us to identify who did what, when, where, and how. Domain 10, physical security. Again, physical access means game over. If your systems are not properly secured, like, for example, if they're not behind locked doors, cameras, if you don't have your data, if on mobile devices, your data is not encrypted, then physical access to your devices means the attacker has access to your data. It has to do with physical security as a layered defense, just like logical security should be. It serves to deter and delay the advance of an attacker until a response team can apprehend the attacker. And security zones are configured so that the closer a person gets to, or an attacker gets to to very sensitive systems or data, the stronger the security might get. So, for example, getting into an office building might just require showing a badge to a guard. But getting into the data center, a security zone, might require that you actually scan a token or use biometrics to get in. And it's not just the data center that can be a security zone. It's any area where we have systems that access sensitive data in the data center. So you, on the financial floor, for example, in a financial office, there may be additional security you need to get into the finance office where people are actually using the data. Now we're going to move on to categories of controls. The 6 categories that the CISSP organization defines are detective, deterrent, preventive, corrective, recovery, and compensating. Let's use a graphic to walk through these. So deterrence is usually a combination of both prevention and detection. Anything that an attacker sees or hears or reads or whatever about how well an organization prevents intrusions or detects intrusions will affect whether or not the attacker targets that organization. So let's take physical security, for example. If an attacker sees a double fence with concertina wire across the top and concertina wire between the fences, chances are that she is not going to try to get through the fence unless she is very highly motivated. And that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit when we get to risk assessments. Likewise, if there are multiple layers of physical controls between the attacker and his target, then the attacker would have to be highly motivated and highly skilled to get through those controls before reaching his target. And the same thing applies to layered controls that we would have in place, the logical controls that we would have in place to protect our data. So prevention controls are things like access control, intrusion prevention systems, and firewalls. Anything that actually prevents traffic or prevents an attacker from passing from one point to another. Detection controls include SIEMs, which are security information and event management systems or log management systems, intrusion detection systems, cameras, and other things that detect when an attacker is in the process of trying to reach a target or has already reached a target and is extracting data from your organization. Corrective controls are usually part of incident response or root cause analysis. They allow us to plug any gaps that allowed an attacker to reach her objectives. And recovery controls are those that are included in business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans. These are controls that allow us to restore business critical processes by restoring the technology that supports them if a server fails or if there's a catastrophic event. And finally, we have compensating controls. Compensating controls are used when one or more controls are not reasonable and appropriate for an organization. They can be too costly or they can hinder business operation. In other words, they cost more than they're worth. So if we put in a compensating control, it must achieve the same security outcomes as the original control. And original controls are recommended by standards of best practice, by regulations, etc. Whatever compensating control that we implement, again, it must achieve the same outcomes as the recommended or original control. Now we're going to move on to security governance, follow that with risk management. They're two very closely related topics. So governance is about guaranteeing that there is a security program in place and that it is managed and overseen by management, making sure that the outcomes they expect are the outcomes that are actually being achieved. So according to the text that we're using, governance guarantees that the appropriate information security activities are being performed to ensure that the risks are appropriately reduced, the information security investments are appropriately directed, and the executive management has visibility into the program and is asking the appropriate questions to determine the effectiveness of the program. So how do we do this? Well, governance activities include defining roles and responsibilities. So who is actually responsible for defining policy? And who's responsible for each policy? Who's responsible for implementing security controls? Who's responsible for monitoring security controls and for monitoring and log management? Conduct audits and tests. Regular audits should be conducted. These should include internal audits as well as external IT audits. And testing should include vulnerability scanning as well as penetration tests. Training should be conducted. This should include at least annual security training supported by awareness activities such as posters, newsletters, emails, and other various things that keep security foremost in the minds of the employees. And this also includes training all new employees so that they understand what's expected of them from a regulatory and from an internal policy perspective. Developing and managing security policies is the foundation of governance and the foundation of any security program. The policies should clearly state management's expectations about the levels of risk that are acceptable, and should also include sanctions against employees or anyone else who violates those policies. From those policies, we derive standards, baselines, guidelines, and procedures to achieve those policy outcomes. And finally, management must inspect what it expects. It must conduct oversight of expected outcomes. Finally, management must ensure proper alignment with operational and strategic business objectives. This includes the director of security, as I was at one time, in working closely with management to ensure that whatever we're doing in security actually enables the business, not hinders the business. It enables the business to reach its operational and business objectives safely. And the last one is very important. Governance activities must demonstrate to all stakeholders that the organization is taking reasonable and appropriate steps to safeguard sensitive data and critical business processes. Perceptions are very important. That doesn't mean that we should engage in security theater, which is the implementation of controls just so people feel good. But it is demonstrating to those stakeholders that the company is serious about security and is doing what is reasonable and appropriate to protect information and critical systems. Some of the things that governance is involved with is reorganization activities that affect security. These include acquisitions and mergers, which introduce additional data types, new staff and roles, threats from former employees, and new vulnerabilities from merging the organizational infrastructures. And in addition to acquisitions and mergers, the organization could divest itself of one or more lines of business. This also can affect security and the safety of the data that was collected when the two organizations were one. These activities are important because we must protect the data no matter where it's going or where it's coming from. And it's important that all new staff coming from an acquisition or merger understands the policies of the parent organization and what's expected of them. Now we get into the core of security, which is risk management. According to the text, risk management provides a mechanism to the organization to ensure that executive management knows current risks, and informed decisions can be made to use one of the risk management principles: risk avoidance, risk transfer, risk mitigation, or risk acceptance. Risk avoidance is just not to do what would increase the risk. So the company wants to implement a new capability using a piece of software that it's found. If the risk is considered way too high and the cost of mitigating that risk is higher than the value of the solution, the organization may just avoid the risk by not implementing that solution. Risk transfer is purchasing insurance to cover any business impact, business losses. Risk mitigation is to implement controls that will mitigate the risk. And risk acceptance is management's decision to simply say, okay, the risk is not too high. It is reasonable and appropriate given the value that we receive from the system or business process or solution that is exhibiting the risk. So when we look at risk, we look at threats, vulnerabilities, and business impact. The first formula on this slide is the basic formula that we see most. So threats are those people, processes, or devices, anything that can exploit a weakness in our network, a vulnerability, and cause business impact. Another way of looking at this is threats times vulnerabilities also reflect the probability of occurrence. It's very important to understand likelihood or probability of occurrence, because that lets us know whether or not we need to be concerned or how often something might happen that would cost the business money, either current revenue or future revenue. Another way to look at that is the last formula, means plus motive times opportunity. An attacker must have the necessary skills to exploit a vulnerability. In other words, it has to be the attacker must be able to get through your layered defenses to reach a vulnerability. How hard an attacker works at this is determined by motive. How motivated is the attacker? If the attacker is going to make a lot of money, then he will probably spend more time trying to get through your defenses to get to the target data. If the attacker is motivated by political issues, again, that attacker may spend a lot of time trying to get through your defenses. So, likelihood of occurrence is a function of the nature of the threat, the means and motive of the threat, and any vulnerabilities or opportunities that exist for that attacker. So to determine risk, we do conduct risk assessments. And there are two types of risk assessments, quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative assessments use actual dollar amounts. And using a quantitative assessment solely is not something I've seen done very often, because it's very difficult to get the organization to sit down and put dollar amounts to every single loss that might occur. That doesn't mean that we ignore quantitative information. As we'll see later, we use the quantitative approach somewhat when conducting a qualitative assessment. But anyway, in a quantitative assessment, there are 4 components. The first thing that we determine after we identify the system that we want to assess is the exposure factor. If a specific threat hits that system, how much value how much business impact would there be? Let's say that we think that we would lose 50% of the business value of an asset if there was an event. So if the exposure factor would be 0.5. The single loss expectancy, therefore, is the asset value times the exposure factor. So if the asset value is $100,000 and you multiply it times the exposure factor of 0.5, then the single loss expectancy would be $50,000. The annual rate of occurrence is how often we think that that threat would be able to exploit the vulnerability and impact the system, resulting in a single loss expectancy. And that could happen, let's say we think it'll happen every 5 years. If that's the case, then the annual rate of occurrence would be 0.20, which is 1/5. Because we always annualize our costs of attacks. We annualize our risks. So the annualized loss expectancy is the single loss expectancy, which again is asset value times exposure factor, times the likelihood or the probability that the attack will happen in a single year, which is the annual rate of occurrence. And in this case, we're saying that it is 0.20. So in our example, the single loss expectancy was $50,000. We said that the annual rate of occurrence was 0.20, which is 1/5. So if we multiply the single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence, we end up with $10,000. So if we use this method, the quantitative assessment method, we're saying that the risk associated with the threats and vulnerabilities that we found during the risk assessment would cost the business $10,000 a year. If we need to implement new controls to prevent that loss, the controls should cost less than the annualized loss expectancy. And the cost of a control includes the purchase of the control, the implementation costs of the control, as well as the annual management of the control, annualized over the life of the control. So if you determine that a control is going to cost you $12,000 a year and you're trying to mitigate a $10,000 risk, then you either look for another set of controls or you accept the risk. Qualitative assessments are much different. They don't really use dollars. They use values. For example, values 1 through 5. And an example of how this might look is this risk calculator. This risk calculator is available for download at the link shown at the bottom of the slide, and detailed information about how to use it is available in the book chapter in the first link below. So if you notice, instead of using dollars, we're assigning numbers, and these numbers can reflect low, medium, high, as they do in this case. And then they also reflect it with a value as opposed to dollar amounts, the probability or likelihood of occurrence, and the business impact. And those two values, probability and business impact, are multiplied together to come up with a risk value. So which one's better, qualitative or quantitative? Well, qualitative is faster. It doesn't require managers to calculate dollar exposure. It's used for quick assessments, especially when, let's say, you're doing your daily threat assessment to see if there's any new threats coming out or any new vulnerabilities that have been announced over the last 24 hours. A qualitative assessment is an excellent way to do a quick look to see how much risk your business is actually exposed to because of these new things. It doesn't always provide enough bottom line impact information, however, and to do a qualitative assessment, it requires assessors who are long-term employees with significant experience with the business and its critical systems. Quantitative assessments provide managers with impact in dollars. This is something that managers understand. However, they're slower and sometimes impossible due to lack of resources. So we use a hybrid approach. In a hybrid approach, we start with qualitative assessments, and then we work with management to determine what exactly do these values translate into in dollars. I mean, approximately what is the cost to the business if the system is unavailable for some reason or the data is stolen? What is the approximate cost? And we use that information then to do a cost-benefit analysis for any recommended controls, any controls we recommend as a result of our risk assessment. This is not an exact science, but it works very, very well. It's the approach that I used when I was director of security, and we we were always able to work well with management to determine whether or not something was worth fixing, not worth fixing. We were able to demonstrate to management the actual risk the business was at. And so using one of these to the exclusion of the other is probably not a good idea, because it can grind your risk management processes to a halt if you're waiting for someone to calculate all the dollar amounts involved, and qualitative assessments aren't always detailed enough to determine whether or not the cost of controls is worth the risk mitigation. So, risk assessment steps. So what we've just gone through, the looking at threats and vulnerabilities and business impact, are all part of a system risk assessment. So step one, system characterization. Inputs, hardware, software, system interfaces, data information, people, and system mission. What critical business processes does it support? The output of this activity are system boundaries and also trust boundaries. At what point do you allow people, processes, and devices to cross over into the system? And what kind of levels of trust do those people, processes, and devices need to have to cross that boundary into the system? System functions, system and data criticality, and this requires classifying data, and system and data sensitivity. Again, it requires classifying data. Data is classified based on its need for confidentiality and integrity, but it's also classified based on how critical it is to ongoing business operation. Step through 2, threat identification. The inputs to this activity are history of system attack, data from intelligence agencies and other assessment organizations, and the output is a threat statement. In other words, what are the likely threats? And this is important. What are the likely or probable threats against the system? Vulnerability identification. The inputs to the activity are reports from prior risk assessments, any audit comments, security requirements that have been defined based on standards and guidelines or the standard of best practice used by the organization, security test results, and those include vulnerability scans and penetration tests. And the output from this activity is a list of potential vulnerabilities. Control analysis looks at the current controls and any planned controls and provides us with a list of those controls so that we can determine exactly what the risk is to the organization from the threats and vulnerabilities that have been identified. And this is where we get our information to determine likelihood. The inputs to likelihood are the threat source motivation, which we've talked about before, the means or threat capacity of that threat, the nature of the vulnerability. Vulnerabilities are not all the same. Some vulnerabilities for example, could allow free access to a system. Other vulnerabilities only allow very limited access. So what is the nature of the vulnerabilities that we actually found? And how do the current controls mitigate those vulnerabilities? How do they help to prevent the threat from getting to those vulnerabilities, or exploiting those vulnerabilities, or if they exploit a vulnerability, from moving forward to the next stage in the attack? One of the best tools for this is an attack tree, as now shown on the screen. An attack tree allows us to step through the attack path that an attacker would have to take, whether from internal locations or from an external location, to reach her objective. This will give us a very good idea of how well our controls are working or where there might be gaps in our controls. Step 6 is impact analysis. The input to this activity, the inputs, are mission impact analysis. So how does it affect the mission of the business if if an attack is successful or loss of data occurs, if data is no longer available. Asset criticality assessment, data criticality, data sensitivity. Data criticality and data sensitivity directly impact the classification of the data that is processed by or stored by the system. And what is the effect on confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the vulnerability exploits? And the output will be an impact rating or dollar amount. So impact analysis gives us our business impact. And whether this can be either by qualitative or quantitative means. And again, it's usually going to be a combination of the two. So step 7 is likelihood of occurrence, magnitude of impact, and adequacy of existing or planned controls as inputs. And the output is a risk and associated risk levels. Again, the risk is going to be prioritized either by dollar amount or value. And how that's done is going to be based on whether you did a qualitative or a quantitative assessment. And again, it's not just about threats and vulnerabilities. It's also about how well your controls are going to work. So if we take one of those formulas that we have, we might look at it again with the controls as the divisor. So you take your threats times your vulnerabilities times your business impact, or your probability of occurrence times business impact, and you divide it by your controls. Your controls will mitigate the risk associated with your threats, vulnerabilities, and business impact. And finally, steps 8 and 9, control recommendation and results documentation. Once we determine whether or not our controls are sufficient to mitigate risk to acceptable levels, then we look at ways to either implement new controls if necessary, or to recommend to management that nothing really needs to be done based on our current controls framework. If we recommend new controls, then it should be based on a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, if the annualized loss expectancy is greater than the cost of new controls, then we should recommend the new controls. However, if the annualized loss expectancy is less than the cost of the controls we've identified, then we either need to look for additional controls if we think the risk is still too high, or we need to recommend risk acceptance. We don't make these final decisions. It's up to management. It's our responsibility to recommend to management what we think they should do with the risk. And any controls that we recommend should conform to the organization's security architecture and adopted standard of best practice, and should also be compliant with any applicable regulations. So this is where regulations is where cost-benefit analysis sometimes takes a back seat. Even if we believe that the cost of the controls is more than what we think the cost to the business would be, the actual dollars in lost sales or something of that nature, the regulatory constraints upon the organization may require that we implement controls anyway. And then we have the results documentation, which is the risk assessment findings and recommendations. Always include an executive briefing, because even though the technical information that you have gathered is going to be necessary for mitigating risk, executives don't need to see that. What they need to see is, what is my risk? How does it impact the business? And what can I do to mitigate it? Or should I just accept it based on the information that you provide in your report about cost of controls, about likelihood of occurrence, those types of things. So you have to give management what they need to make a decision, but what they need to make a decision is more based on operational and strategic objectives being met or being stopped, and much less about any kind of technical findings. All you're going to do if you provide technical findings to management is get a lot of glassy-eyed stares, and you might lose them. And then you're not going to get the budget dollars necessary to mitigate the risk. And finally, we're going to go over some major security risks. These are by far not all of them, but they pretty much present most of what is faced by organizations today. First one is insider threats. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, insider threats are not the most common, but they can be the most damaging, primarily because an insider is difficult to detect. So an insider could operate for months or years, causing extensive damage to the business before he or she is detected and stopped. Unencrypted movement of information. This includes information on mobile devices, which is our last item here on our list, and information between business partners in our organization. Weak access controls. Are our access controls, both for devices, for applications, services, for users, human users, are they strong enough given the criticality of the system and the sensitivity of the data? So do we need strong access controls? In other words, multi-factor, using a password and biometrics, or password and a token. These are things that need to be determined when we're looking at risk assessment issues. Poor device or software configuration. Have we shut down all unused services on our servers and our user devices? Do we allow anything, any open ports? Do we allow anything in our attack surface for the system that isn't absolutely necessary for business operation? And if we do allow access for business operation, how are we maintaining control over those data channels? Lack of employee awareness. Employees are probably our biggest security vulnerability. They need to be aware of what is acceptable behavior and what is unacceptable behavior. This requires training and awareness activities, as we discussed previously. Insecure software development. How well are our developers trained in creating secure software? How well do we vet software that we buy from third parties to ensure that it is secure and that it can be configured to comply with our policies and the expected outcomes of our policies? Social engineering. This goes along with employee awareness. How easy is it for an attacker to employ phishing or spear phishing or whaling or any number of attacks based on getting a user to act in a certain way? How vulnerable is our organization to that? Are our users aware of social engineering attacks and what to look for? Distributed denial service attacks. Are we configured so that if there's a distributed denial of service attack against a outward-facing server, for example, that it doesn't take down an entire critical business process? Mobile devices, both company-owned and bring your own device. Are we securing those devices? Do we control what data goes to those devices? Are our users trained in how to manage those devices when outside the walls of our organization? These are all questions that need to be asked when doing risk assessments. So that's it for this lecture. And if you have any questions, please ask them in the classroom. Send me an email or chat with me. I'm always willing to chat via the university chat application. So this lecture is not intended to replace the reading and the other materials in the classroom. And it's only meant to help understand, to supplement that information. And this information in this lecture is taken from the the ISC squared CISSP common body of knowledge. And this information, most of it, except for the major security risks, which are just, is a list that has come from studying the media over the last year. The rest of the information comes from the official guide, the official common body of knowledge for the from the ISC squared, or the organization that controls and offers the CISSP certification. So this is important information to understand. If you have any questions, please ask it or discuss it in the classroom. And I want to make sure that all of these things are understood before moving on to week 2.